Hello, everyone. I'm Ted Oakley, managing partner here at Oxbow, and I'm always happy to have the CEO and Chief Strategist, Danielle DiMartino Booth of QI Research, because she is one of our most watched people. And Danielle, thanks for being here.
It's great to be with you again, Ted. How are you?
I'm doing great. I want to start off, you always want a compliment in this business when you've done something right. And I have to say, in the very beginning of the year, and the end of last year, you said all along that Chairman Powell would not fold, that he would hold the line on interest rates and keep them high and drive them higher. There were a lot of people disagreed with you, but you ended up being right on that.
Well, I think he's got a stronger constitution than most have given him credit for.
Yeah. So on that note, and we don't have to spend the full time, but I'd just like to know where you think the Fed is headed here, because we are, we're getting long in the tooth in these rates and fairly high, and we're at eight and a half prime. So, something has to pop somewhere in here. So what do you think?
Well, it's interesting you asked that because home equity lines of credit, HELOC loans are rising. You say to yourself, they're paying 9%. How is this possible? But I think that we are at a juncture with disinflationary pressures really prevalent and spreading. And you're hearing Fed officials repeat one another, echo one another, saying, gee, I think we're ready to step back and pause here. And my concern is that people interpret this as being we're anywhere near ready to lower rates, because I just don't think that Powell's going to make that turn until 2024, which means that he's going to surpass Paul Volcker's aggressiveness, if you will. People always say, well, interest rates were 20% back then. Starting points matter, deltas matter, the change matters, and Chair Powell's been more aggressive than Volcker was, and it looks like he's going to push out his campaign for longer. And even when he does start to lower rates, and this is something I've been throwing around that really scrambles people's brains. Lori Logan is fairly new as the president at the Dallas Federal Reserve. She's a lifetime Fed economist, came from the New York Fed, and she threw a theory out a few weeks ago that said we could start to lower interest rates, but at the same time continue shrinking the balance sheet. Now, Powell reiterated this possibility when he was at the podium after the most recent FOMC meeting. So it's clearly becoming the chosen path going forward to run neutral monetary policy. They'll have to rewrite all the textbooks for Economics 101, because this has never been tried before, but it goes to show you about what higher for longer could look like. The Lacey Hunt, other deposits liability could continue to come down. Liquidity could continue to be depleted from the system with a falling Fed funds rate. And I mean, spoiler alert, this is the big thing. The Fed has not been able to roll mortgage-backed securities off of its balance sheet because nobody wants to get out of their 2.5%, 2.75% 30-year fixed mortgage. If you start to pull interest rates down, the Fed could go back and say, back in June of 2022, we really wanted to reduce our mortgage-backed securities position. Now that we're lowering interest rates, we'll be able to play some catch-up as mortgage-backed securities prepayments increase. So you could actually see an acceleration of QT at the same time you're seeing falling interest rates, which boggles the mind. But I think that's the direction they're going to take.
Well, that would catch people by surprise, because when you look at it, they actually are. At that point they become a competitor in the open marketplace, because if they're going to be pushing paper out and pulling liquidity out of the system, then it would be a point where, and you make some good points about this. I hope later on we'll show some of those slides you have on rejection and that kind of thing. Well, if there's not enough money, then all of a sudden, we can't loan you if we don't have enough. That's sort of where you end up being. But that's interesting. So would you think, though, that they're probably getting close to the end of raising rates? I know it's hard to say either way, but just it seemed like you're getting, obviously we're closer than we were 15 months ago.
Well, so, we had so many bond trader types mentioned to us, this truflation, TRUFLATION, this truflation alternative metric that's based on, oh, I don't know, 10 million real-time prices. And we actually got in touch with the company, QI did, and they gave us all of the data back to January of 2012. We ran a simple correlation with headline, and we came out with a lovely number of 0.97. So there's almost a perfect correlation with trueflation and what we're going to see with headline CPI going forward. And right now it's reading 2.3%. So we know that the boomerang effect in rentals is going to be vicious. There's so much supply coming online in multifamily. So that's going to be a drag on your largest input to inflation, which is housing. We know that food prices have also started to come down. Food prices are twice that of energy prices, which may take some Texans by surprise, but the input is twice as large as that of energy. So yes, we'll see a pop in gasoline prices in this next July print of the CPI. But in terms of what's behind it, the momentum really is faltering, and that's going to give the Fed license to lower interest rates as the labor market continues to deteriorate.
You know, you're talking about apartments. There's a great article, opening article on Wall Street Journal front page today on multifamily. Got a great chart there and talking about all the multifamily that's coming on the market and how so much of it is financed variably. So it's going to be a tough market for the apartment business.
It is, and at the same time, you've had Zillow's tracking American homeowners' appetite for selling their homes. It's kind of been this flat line at 15% since the pandemic hit, and it just popped up to 25% of existing home sellers are willing to put their homes on the market. This is going to collide with rental prices falling and a real loss of appetite for new home building and existing home sales at these super high levels. So you're going to see this collision in the U.S. housing market that's been this bastion of strength that will not be the case anymore because lending standards are tightening there as much as they are for credit cards or car loans.
Well, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and talk to you about, you've done a lot of great work where we are employment-wise, where a lot of people are really not seeing the true facts. They just see that one number that pops every month and think everything's great. They can't see below the surface on this thing. And you do a great job of talking about that, and then how that works into people and how leveraged they are in where they're doing things. And so if you go into that a little bit, it'd be great.
So, we look at leading indicators. We've seen whether it's from retailers in Texas, where 10 cents of every dollar of U.S. consumption takes place. They're downsizing. The same thing with many other regional feds in terms of their labor market indicators. So we try and look at what's going to precede the official unemployment rate, the official non-farm payroll. But even if you just boil down to that, we looked back to in post-war history to see, when was the last time you had 17 straight months of an unemployment rate that was south of 3.75%. How rare is that? And we found two other precedents. That's it. From March of 1968, January, I believe, of 1951. But that's it. Moreover, I'm sure you're going to put this one chart up where we plotted it out. We're more and more of the view that the pandemic provided the U.S. fiscal authorities an excuse to pump a bunch of money into the economy. The Fed monetized it all at the time, of course, but we're more and more of the mind that the current labor market cycle began in 2016.
Well, and that chart that you show is excellent because it outlines on the right piece of that how obviously the employment rate is low, but if you look at the private payroll index diffusion going negative, something on that has to change eventually here.
That's right. I mean, we're literally running out of industries that have demand for new workers.
And then you also have a great chart. I hadn't seen this before, but called "Not Hiring Anyone," and you've got. There's a lot of industries and on service and production on there.
52 industries that Indeed.com, which is, of course, the largest purveyor of real-time labor market data, they track 52 separate industries.
Yeah, and I mean, there wasn't one, the graph you have here, there's not one of those plus.
Well, there is one, the very last one, and that's because of what happened in the classroom during the pandemic. So yeah, there's a need for teachers because you have so many millions of American students who've been out of the classroom for a few years. It's not the easiest profession, but education and instruction of all 52 is the only one with a plus sign in front of it.
And you have a graph entitled talking about crossing the Rubicon into recession.
Mm-hmm.
What do you gather from that graph?
So last September, there wasn't a single state that had rising ranks of continuing claimants, individuals in that state who were collecting unemployment benefits. Last September, that number was 0. Today, that number is 48. So the only states where you don't have rising continuing claims year over year are Kentucky, Oklahoma, and Alaska. That's it. So to go from 0 to 48, that encompasses 94% of the states. It encompasses 97% of the U.S. population. So there's absolutely no evidence to suggest that we haven't seen a massive broadening out in the percentage of states that are experiencing rising joblessness, and it coincides only with recession in the past. There are no other parallels. You can't say we're late cycle or sliding in. The only other time we've seen 97% of the U.S. population living in a state with rising continuing claimants is in recession.
Yeah, and it's interesting. How do you see this? Because everybody, you know, when you listen around, and even economists, people talk about the fact that I'm not certain they're either not looking at the numbers or they don't look at there's something they don't look at because it's sort of right in front of you. You can see the weakness, but you keep reading about the fact that hey, there is no weakness, but there is.
So you know, I'm starting to think of most sell-side economists as akin to stock jocks. You know, until they see 300,000 in weekly initial jobless claims. Of course, they're discounting the fact that 32% are rejected. So you're not actually seeing the full picture of initial jobless claimants when 32% are being told by their Department of Labor, no, the appeal process takes longer than 100 days. This is a Century Foundation initiative that looked inside of all of these data. But until these stock jock type of economists see 300,000 in initial jobless claims, as well as a 4% handle on the unemployment rate, nothing's going to faze them, including, you know, being in Maine and talking to people about, oh, I know somebody who lost his job down at the local whatever.
Well, let me ask you, are you starting to see that work its way, those people losing their jobs? You know, we just had Yellow Freight come out this past week. Are you starting to finally notice that taking an impact? You've got a lot of great charts on how that affects the income and how that would affect eventually discretionary spending and that sort of thing. You might talk about that a little bit.
So after having spent 2 months in the great state of Indiana, this is Indiana in terms of a percentage of its gross state product, 38% of it is tied to the manufacturing industry. No other state in the country is as dependent on its factory sector. Kentucky's pretty high up there, but no other state is as dependent on its manufacturing sector, and we're seeing one plant after another close. We just had a Jeep manufacturer in Highland Park, Michigan, which I recently visited, but we just had a large Jeep auto supplier close there, and you're seeing more and more of this as the bankruptcy cycle ratchets up. And there's also this very quiet downsizing among U.S. retailers. In July, Walgreens announced it was going to close 150 stores. That's a lot of people. Just a few days ago, CVS said that it was going to be reducing its headcount by 5,000 individuals. And you're starting to sniff out a parallel to Office Depot, Office Max, and Staples. So are we over pharmacied? And are we going to see a consolidation in a great big gigantic sector of retail that was really juiced by the pandemic era? And it certainly looks like it. And you could replicate that across other kinds of retailers, shoe stores, tennis shoe stores. They're closing as well. So a year ago, it was just a Silicon Valley story. But today, it really is one of U.S. retailers, one of U.S. manufacturers. It's broadening out. And we know that we'll come out of the other end of this AI tunnel a more productive, the buggy whip has kind of come and gone, and we're a more productive society because of it, economy because of it. So we know that AI will eventually benefit, but in the beginning, AI is going to be job destructive. So AI is stepping into this breach at this juncture with a broadening amount of rising unemployment across industries.
We've tried a couple of AI, different sites, and used it, and I have to say that a good bit of the info we get back is an error. It's not correct. So I don't know. It's going to be hard for me to see. I was sort of reminded like of 98 or 99, where everybody thought the internet, anything that had internet beside it, exploded in price. And that's sort of what we've been experiencing the last year. But you have to think that a lot of that will go by the wayside. It's not that it won't work, some of it in the long run, but I think there's a lot of work to be done in that area.
Ted, it's funny you say that, because I've heard the same thing from my friends in the law community, that AI will invent case law that doesn't exist in trying to help write a decision. So no, we've definitely got some bumps along the way, and I think a lot of publicly traded companies are getting way too much credit for being pioneers in the AI space just because an executive makes mention of it. That doesn't mean they figured it out.
So let's talk about a couple of detailed items. I would say you do a lot of work on autos. Not only auto incentives and that whole thing, but what's happening and people taking auto loans. It's a big part of the economy. So you might talk about that some. You've got 3 or 4 great graphs on that. So
it's with good reason that I'm following autos so closely in the current episode. It's the same reason that I followed subprime mortgages to the extent that I did in 04, 05, and 06. It was where Americans were able to buy way more than they could afford. So you've got 20% of car payments that are north of $1,000. Edmunds reported that the average payment is the highest on record. You've got people extending car loans out to 7-8 years. That's a mortgage.
Tesla just did it. They just did it last week. 84 months.
There you go. So none of that makes sense, and yet you are seeing, with borrowing costs at a 2-decade high, you're seeing consumers continue to buy these cars, even as lending standards are clamping down. And whether you're talking about an auto loan or a credit card or requesting an increase on your line of credit with the credit card company, they're telling us that in the next 12 months, lenders are telling us that in the next 12 months, we're going to be seeing the highest rejection rates possible. And Moody's punctuated that overnight by saying, by the way, we're taking down Capital One, we're taking down Ally Financial, among other small, mid-size banks. They're reducing the ratings on these banks because they see the writing on the wall with charge-offs and delinquencies at the highest on record. And we've still got an unemployment rate at 3.5%.
You did this one particular graph I have to commend you on. It has so much info. People really look at it, both sides of it. On the one side, which I was not aware that it was so high, you go into the probability of being rejected on a credit card, then rejected on the limit. You go on, and those numbers are really, really high. I'm talking about 30 or 40% now, and nobody thinks about that.
They're enormous. The New York Fed, when the New York Fed published that data, it published current data as opposed to just future data. And for car loans, we were already at record rejection rates today. And at the same time, you've got Detroit pumping out cars. The production lines are pumping out all these vehicles because they finally got the semiconductors on hand. So, you kind of see where you're headed down the road between supply and demand, with credit standards clamping down to the extent that they are.
Well, on the other side, we do quite a bit of business. We know a lot of car dealers, and they tell us that they get EVs pushed down on them, and they can't sell them. And where people want, a combustion engine, and so that's been a problem for it. But on the right-hand side of that same graph, okay, you have the 60-month auto loan rate, and it is really something to look at. It goes all the way back to 05 and 06, and it's straight up in the last 12 months to this highest level.
And yet consumers continue to pay these nosebleed levels of interest rates. It's remarkable.
That was the other part of that graph that I found interesting. That other gold line on there, orange line, goes straight up too. And I'm thinking, okay, it's sort of like you talked about on the home equity loans. You know, I don't care. I'll pay the whatever percentage it is, and nobody's thinking about it. So it's an interesting. You talk a little bit about too. You have a great chart on auto incentives that how they will eventually drive disinflation.
Well, and they will, because again, you have this confluence of factors, and Lord knows what it's going to look like after September the 1st, when interest starts to be accrued on student loans, and then October the 1st, when you've got payment resumption for anybody who makes pretty much more than $60,000 a household. So when you see that happen, what are manufacturers going to do at that point when demand dries up even more? And you know, I had an hour-long talk with a GMC dealership up here in Indiana over the summer, and he said, you know, the owners were very gracious, and they allowed me to not charge over MSRP throughout the pandemic, when so many dealers were just, oh my gosh, we poke their eyes out. We can just take them. But he said, but I know that in 2023 and in 2024, when these buyers come back to me after 3 years and want to trade in their car and buy a new one, that they're not going to be so far upside down that they can't take out a new car. He said, but you name it, Michigan, Ohio, all of the states around me, that's the practice that they had. These recent new car buyers are going to go in to trade these cars in, and they're going to be so upside down, they're drowning. And so you can see further out over the horizon. It's not just student loans in the next few months, but it's what's to come in terms of marginal future demand that's just not going to be there.
You talk about those student loans, and you have one of the few graphs, it's good, we'll show it, that the highest income earners will be the hardest hit. I don't think the average person would think that.
No, and that really is the crux of some data that Moody's came out with a few weeks ago that showed that they're seeing declining FICO scores all the way up the ladder. And really what that reflects is the fact that when the pandemic hit, those who qualified for the most credit, they moved out to Boise or to Austin, or they moved out to the exurbs. They took these massive mortgages on right after the pandemic hit. They didn't know what a property tax bill was. They bought a BMW, and they said to themselves, you know what, I'm never going to have to pay my $200,000 student loan back. So I'll take on more credit card debt on top of that so that I can outfit my new house in the exurbs and get new wheels for my new BMW. I'm exaggerating, but my point is the Brookings Institute has done some good work that shows that the average student loan borrower took on appreciably more revolving debt during the pandemic and is that much less prepared to resume making payments, which is kind of scary when you consider that, 9.8% of buyers have a payment, of student loan borrowers have a payment between $500 and $800, and 9.4% have a payment that's north of $800 a month. When you think of doesn't matter how much money you make, when you think of take-home pay for a good income earner, that extra $800, $900 a month is going to be meaningful.
I wanted to ask you too, do you think this idea about not being afraid of debt, and it's been going on now for a number of years, do you think that came about because since 2010 or 11, there's always somebody to the rescue, either the Fed or the federal government, and maybe they think that, well, it's okay because if something goes bad, somebody's going to rescue?
Ted, it's frighteningly all over my Twitter feed. You get these angry, entitled millennials who say, you know what, I'll just walk away. And more often than not, because we've been in a zero interest rate environment and lower for longer, you've had lenders who are able to justify, making a loan, a brand new loan to somebody who's got a 7-year black eye on their credit report from a foreclosure or a repossession. So even people who have walked away from their debts have typically been able to tap right back into the debt pipeline because it's been a zero interest rate environment. That's not the case. That's no longer the case. And yet here we go. And they have not, the Biden administration has tried mightily to loosen the bankruptcy laws so that you can expunge these student loans in bankruptcy. But these people are going to discover, depending on the state they live in, that all they might be able to get rid of will be their car loans and their credit card debt, losing their car in the process. And if you're in a state like Texas, you can keep your home. But that student loan payment is going to stay with you.
So let me ask you this. We're going to switch gears a little bit on it, but you have a great chart from Green Street on commercial property values, and I know we see a lot of pain in that area, more than people realize. Actually, what are your thoughts on that? It's a great chart you have.
So I think the fallacy of the current conventional wisdom is that this is a situation that's isolated to the office sector, and that any other type of building outside of that beleaguered office sector is money good. It's not Green Street, but recently it was TREP data that came out with July delinquencies, and they saw a big pop in lodging delinquencies as domestic travel really gets hit hard here in the United States. So it's a much broader issue. And multifamily, as you said, is on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today. Even industrial, I think, is vulnerable because so many retailers are realizing, you know what, we're not the next Amazon. We don't have the means by which to become a great online presence. We don't need that distribution facility. At the same time, Amazon and Walmart both are reducing their warehouse footprint. So even the Teflon sector of industrial looks vulnerable here. And at the same time, you have the street saying soft landing, soft landing, soft landing. Well, there's another chart that I provided you that shows that whether you're looking at residential real estate or commercial real estate, there's simply no transacting going on for there to be price discovery.
Well, and also, Danielle, the people that are saying, hey, we don't want that space, so we're going to sublease it, they are killing the new lease market, because they're undercutting it by 30% or so. And so, eventually all of that comes to play. And I think that's where we are. And you go all around all the big cities, which we do, and you'll see now industrial complex empty. I drove by one this past week, empty. I'm talking about nothing there. It's huge. There's nothing in it.
And then you pile on yellow on top of that. I mean, yellow is going to be great for freight, but yellow had its own massive warehouse footprint. And they said that, yellow alone has got 2 office properties that have large exposure to commercial mortgage-backed securities. That's what people don't realize. They're going, oh, it's just one company that's going bankrupt. There'll be 22 Teamsters and 22,000 Teamsters, 8,000 employees that lose their. When these types of events occur, there are tentacles, there are ripple effects throughout other areas of the economy.
Yeah, it starts to happen. One of the things that you mentioned, and I don't think the average person is probably aware of this, but another one of the government programs gone awry is the employment retention credit. You've got a good chart on it, and I did not realize that much of the business dough had gone in there like your charts show. It's interesting, and you talk about it, but I know sort of a little bit what you think about it, but it's I don't think the average person does.
No, I had an almost 3-hour drive from the middle of nowhere in Maine yesterday to the Bangor airport, and listening to Bloomberg radio, I heard no fewer than 6 advertisements. Today, you too, pick up the phone and call. You qualify to get your $26,000 per employee clawed back in payroll taxes. The problem, Ted, is that what was born of the CARES Act to help mainly small businesses get compensated for keeping employees on the payroll. And by the way, this is not supposed to be, you're not supposed to be able to apply for this if you all already got a Paycheck Protection Program loan. Of course, that rule is being broken as well. But what was born of the CARES Act, and we saw a pickup in business income tax refunds. So people are always like, where do you get this mysterious data? I'm like, on the Treasury's website every single day. It's public public information, public data. But we saw this major ramp up when ambulance chasing type of firms became invested in selling the employee retention credit. And now that they're big marketers of this, I get several emails a day. I have people who get 5 phone calls a day. Same with you. So innovationtaxes.com, getrefunds.com, by the way, same parent company, 2 different companies advertising. But what we saw was starting in the fall of 2022, when the marketing really took off, that we started to press towards $20 billion a month. In December, the U.S. government paid out nearly $26 billion in these proceeds. $26 billion is relevant. In July, we crossed the $30 billion Rubicon for the first time. Let me contextualize for you what $400 billion pumped into the U.S. economy looks like in this environment with so much of the private sector slowing. It's 1.5 percentage points of GDP growth. And it's little wonder that we're seeing such quote unquote resilience in services spending. And the wealthy seem to be out there spending like mad. It must be the wealth effect from the stock market. No, it's not. They're getting cash from Uncle Sam. They're getting cash from taxpayers, and they're splurging. They're putting mom, dad, the sister-in-law they can't stand, the kids, the dog. They're all flying first class to Paris. And we've seen international travel simply take off. You've got that chart to share, and there's no mistaking that one has accompanied the other. And the flip side, of course, is Southwest Airlines, Alaska, JetBlue. The people who are not on the receiving end of this employee retention credit, i.e. the other 80% of income earners underneath that top quintile, they're seeing nothing. And that's why we're seeing domestic travel take such a hit. But this ERC thing, I've spoken to investigative reporters at 5 different news outlets. We're going to get Congress's attention here.
Well, you would hope so. That's for sure, because it skews the situation. If you take that and what the federal government pumped in the first 6 months of the year, that's what causes all this stuff, again, to not look correct. But you have, in sort of a finishing up graph you have here, you have a graph about how the downward revisions may eventually push the economy over the edge and you go into recession. Might visit on that a little bit.
So it's really fascinating. If you set aside consumer spending, which we've just covered, we really have just covered consumer spending with this mystery input of the employee retention credit. If you set aside the employee retention credit and the headline payroll figures, every other metric every other of the 7 metrics tracked by the National Bureau of Economic Research, since 1950, they've been the arbiter who says the United States is or is not in recession, is or is not in expansion. The reason we've seen that entity so quiet, in my view, is because the revisions continue to come out, whether it's industrial production. You get the current month reported, and then you have to look over to the right on your Bloomberg screen to see what that downward revision was to the prior month. And we've seen the steadiness of revisions. The Bureau of Labor Statistics came out last week, and they said, in the second, third, and fourth quarters of 2022, we overestimated by 816,000 the number of jobs created because we have this very shady birth-death adjustment. So in the midst of bankruptcies ramping up to the highest since the great financial crisis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics bean counters have got tons of businesses being born. Of course, it doesn't make sense. But again, you don't get the truth until you get the revisions. So we're really looking forward to August 23rd with the release that day of the annual benchmark payroll revisions. The last one that we saw was absolutely awful. And given what we've just seen with this latest revision, we fully anticipate rewriting history once again when we get the revisions.
So Danielle, if line him up, and if you were talking to an individual investor, for example, would you say that your advice would be to be a little careful in here because the soft landing or no landing may not necessarily take place, if I'm reading everything you put together here?
Well, I think that is the biggest risk. We're seeing disinflation be very global in its scope. Trade in China is exports in China are declining at the fastest pace since the pandemic first hit. Germany is also experiencing revisions, downward revisions. It looks like now, because of their industrial production downward revision, that they will be in a third consecutive quarter of contraction. So I've just taken out the first and third largest exporting nations in the world, and the average sell-side economist would then try and convince me that the United States is on an economic island, and that it can avoid, all of the stress in the rest of the world, to say nothing of what's happening in its private sector. So no, I think you have to be extremely nimble here. It's the investor that's patient, especially in prior cycles. You just had to deal with the zero interest rate environment if you wanted to be on the sidelines, getting nothing for it. In today's environment, you can get 6% for sitting on your hands and keeping your powder dry for a time when the buying opportunity really is there. If you look at the CAPE, if you look at the long-term price to earnings ratio, we've miraculously come down from 39 times to 33 times. Woo! But for nothing where valuations should be in terms of a genuine value moment where you can step into the market and you get paid to be on the sideline. So it's not a bad time to be prudent, as unsexy as that might be.
Yeah. Well, the other side, if you look at the forward multiples on the S&P right now, it typically, never has happened in the past. Maybe this time it does, but it's never happened that you would start a new bull market from this high a level that we have right now in forward earnings. But listen, I want to thank you so much for visiting with us today. I would recommend to people and we've included this 3 or 4 times here so you can see the QI research. And there's, gosh, I don't know how many products you have, but I think you have at least 10 or 12. I mean, I read them all the time, and I've always said this to you, but I think you're one of the greatest writers. I don't know where you get all the info, but you can sure put it together all the time.
Sometimes I I'm old-fashioned. I've got a piece of paper and a pen by my bed at night. I wake up in the middle of the night. Oh my gosh, I've got to write this down. It's a great pleasure, and I think that's why our clients appreciate the research as much as they do, because we enjoy creating it. But we've had a really amazing transition to the Substack platform. It's been great for us in terms of distribution capabilities and the ability to go back and forth and interact with our clients. So DiMartino Booth.substack.com. Would love to have you stop by and take our research for a test drive. I'm biased, but it really is second to none.
Yeah, a lot of good stuff there. So listen, Danielle, thank you, and we'll look forward to seeing you again, hopefully within the next year.
Absolutely, Ted. I look forward to it as well. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. Hello, everyone. I just want to say, if you like this video and you want to see more of this type of information, because we really try to get the information that you don't see from anybody else, then be sure and click on subscribe, and you'll see more of what we do here at Oxbow.